This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is the beginning of Throne of Eldraine Limited Set Review Week here on my channel. Throne of Eldraine was fully revealed yesterday, and that means that for the next week or so, I'll be putting out a new video every day about the new limited format. To start with, I'll be doing a series of videos where I give you my thoughts on the limited potential of all the cards in this set, going color by color. Later in the week, I'll also be doing an archetype guide and a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. In this video, we're going to look at every single white card in the set. Before we delve into our first card, if you aren't familiar with how I grade them, you can find an explanation in the description, so check that out if you need to. Alright, let's get to our first white card, which is Acclaimed Contender, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/3 human knight at rare. When it enters the battlefield, if you control another knight, you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a knight, aura, equipment, or legendary artifact card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, a 3-mana 3/3 is a decent playable in most formats, a C, if your deck can consistently draw a card off of this, something that really isn't far-fetched if you're in white. There are a lot of knights in this set. So, making it so you actually get to look at the top 5 cards of your library is pretty easy, and it's actually easier to hit a card on the top of your library in most cases, since it's not only knights, but auras and equipment that you can hit with it. But a 3-mana 3/3 that draws you a card is a very, very good card in Limited. It's always going to give you a 2-for-1. This is the kind of card that's sort of a build around, but what it asks you to do isn't all that crazy, so I don't think I need to give it a build around grade. I'm just going to say that it's a B, and that you can feel fine about first picking it, especially because the fail case is a very reasonable card, and the upside it has is very substantial. Next is All That Glitters, which for 1 generic and a white is an enchantment aura at uncommon. It's an enchant creature. An enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. I'm not super high on this. The blue-white deck in this format is focused on having artifacts and enchantments, which is nice and all, but this doesn't seem like the payoff you really want. It has the downside most auras have, in that it opens you up to a bad 2-for-1, and in addition to that, it isn't going to be very good in the early game, even if you are an artifact enchantment deck. Sometimes, auras that are ultra aggressive early can be good because they make your creature do so much damage that it doesn't matter when you get 2-for-1. This won't be one of those auras most of the time. And yeah, food pumps it and all that, but I'm going to be skeptical about this card for now. I think it's an F in your typical deck in the format, and maybe a D if you get there on artifacts and enchantments. Next up, we have Archon of Absolution, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 Archon at uncommon. It's got flying, it has protection from white, and it says creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays 1 for each of those creatures. This seems like a pretty good card to me. A 4-mana 3/2 with flying is already a decent rate in Limited and a fine playable, but this comes with protection from white and a Ghostly Prison type effect, both of which raise the power level here significantly. The prison effect can make it very hard for your opponent to continue to develop their board and attack, so you start making them have to choose one or the other, and that's a great way to get ahead. Meanwhile, it is immune to 20% of the cards in the set, give or take, and that's pretty nice too. Keep in mind there is some downside to the protection from white. If you want to use a combat trick on your Archon of Absolution and it's white, you're not going to be able to do it. So it's not all upside, it's just mostly upside. But I think I would feel pretty good about first picking one of these, and I'm giving it a B. Next up is Ardenvale Paladin, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/5 human knight at common, and it has adamant. And it says, if at least 3 white mana was spent to cast this spell, Ardenvale Paladin enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. So adamant is a keyword ability we're going to see throughout this set. It's an ability that incentivizes being monocolored or almost monocolored. And that's an interesting theme in this set, which we haven't seen in a long time. There's lots of incentives to be monocolored. So for all of the cards with adamant we see, they're going to be significantly better if you're in a monocolored deck than they would be otherwise. Keep in mind, even in a deck that's sort of half and half with mana, you'll be able to cast this with the counter on it a portion of the time. So it's not like you're never going to do it if you're not mono-white, it's just going to be a lot more likely. In this case, a 4-mana 2/5 does kind of an okay job in the vanilla test anyway, and will be capable of blocking the vast majority of the creatures in this format and surviving. On its own, that would probably be a C-. If you throw an Adamant, which gives you a 4 mana 3/6 a decent chunk of the time, or, all the time if you happen to be mono white, and you end up with a much more attractive card, that would probably be a C+, just because of the efficiency. Now, you can't count on always being able to do that, and as a result, I think this is in between the C- for the worst case scenario and the C+ for the best case. In other words, I think it's just a C. Next, we have Ardenvale Tacticsian, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 2/3 human knight at common. It's a creature who has an adventure, which is an interesting new mechanic in this set. Creatures with adventure can be cast normally, as any old creature can be, but they also have an adventure option that is either an instant or a sorcery. And you can cast that part of the spell anytime you could cast either an instant or sorcery, depending on what it is. In this case, we have Dizzying Swoop, which you can pay 1 generic and a white for, and it allows you to tap up to 2 target creatures. After the adventure half of this card resolves, the card is exiled, and then at some point later in the game, or even that turn if you have the mana, you can cast the adventure creature from exile. So with these adventure cards, I like to think about how good both halves would be as individual cards and then think about them together, as I think this is a good way to break them down and figure out just how good they'll be. If Ardenvale Tactician was only the adventure part of the card, it would be kind of a passable card for a really aggressive deck, something like a D. Taking away the ability to both attack and block for a whole round has its uses. Then we look at the creature half. 3 mana for a 2/3 with flying is pretty nice, probably close to a C+. That's just above rate for most limited formats. Then, when we put it all together, a total investment of 5 mana to tap a couple of things down and play a 2/3 flyer seems pretty decent to me. Then you factor in the flexibility that it can come into play as a creature without going on an adventure if that's what you need to do, and sometimes you'll certainly want to do that. For example, if you're just trying to curve out. And I think in the end, we're looking at a card that is a very easy C+, and could maybe even sneak into B- range. A 3 mana 2/3 flyer with upside is basically what we're looking at here, and I certainly like that. Next up, we have Bartered Cow, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 ox at common, and when it dies, or when you discard it, you create a food token. Food is the third and final new thing in this set. Food are artifact tokens that you can pay 2 and tap, and then sacrifice to gain 3 life. 4 mana 3/3s are usually a D these days. How much value should we give this since it can make food? I mean, it's a little valuable, especially because there are food payoffs, although there aren't a lot of them in white. It is also interesting that you can discard this and get food. It makes sense flavor-wise, but it seems kind of weird color pie-wise. But anyway, I think those two things combined make this better, but I'm still not sure you'll ever be playing this unless you are really desperate for food or a creature, and I think it will feel bad to play this most of the time, and I'm going to give it a D+. Next up, we have Beloved Princess, who for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human noble at common, and she has lifelink, and she can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. A 1 mana 1/1 with lifelink that is kind of evasive doesn't really do it for me. Sure, big creatures can't block her, but it's small and dies to basically any other blocker. Sure, if you pump her, things might get interesting, but it doesn't seem worth it to me unless I'm super desperate for low drops, or maybe I play an opponent who is all about the fatties and I side it in or something. I think it's a D+. I think you just don't play it most of the time. Next up, we have Charming Prince, who for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human noble at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose 1. You scry 2, or you gain 3 life, or you exile another target creature you own and return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next instep. This is a pretty nice card, also kind of funny that they put charm in its name and they gave it a charm effect, even though it's a different kind of charm than we're used to seeing. But yeah, one of these effects will always be useful, and they're all pretty good in the right situation. It is a 2 mana 2/2, which is already a reasonably efficient creature, and then being able to sort of mold it into whatever you need it to be makes this into a pretty nice card for most decks. It's a 2-drop that will basically always do something useful, whether it's smoothing out your draws, gaining you a little bit of life to help you stabilize, helping you abuse and enter the battlefield ability, or get an aura off of one of your creature. It's frequently going to give you a lot of value for only 2 mana, and I think that means it's in the lower range of first pickable in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have the Circle of Loyalty, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a Mythic Rare legendary artifact. There's a whole cycle of these Mythic Rare legendary artifacts for each color. This one says, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each knight you control, and it says creatures you control get +1/+1, and it says whenever you cast a legendary spell, create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance, And it says you can pay 3 generic and a white and tap it to make a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. While this is something of a knight build around and a legendary build around, it's a good card even if you don't have any knights. A 6 mana Anthem effect isn't the greatest deal, but permanents who pump your whole board are not to be underestimated. In any creature-based deck, this is a very real effect, and one that most of the time is going to impact the board immediately. In addition to that, it is a nice mana sink that allows you to produce a knight every single turn, which is actually a 3/3 while it's in play. Now, if we take away the knight and legendary part of this card, this wouldn't be amazing, but it would be a solid card, probably at least a C+. Once we add the other parts of the card, and the fact that the cost can be reduced by knights, and the fact that it makes knights when you cast legendary stuff, and we're getting into a very powerful card that's in first pickable territory. There are legendary spells at uncommon in this format, and that means getting a knight from the legendary part of the card isn't exactly a pipe dream, but yeah, with the cost reduction part, even one knight being in play makes this substantially better, and that's not going to be hard to do. We've already seen a bunch of knights. We're going to see a bunch more in white as well as in black and red, and they actually appear in every color. Those are just the 3 most plentiful colors for knights. I think this is definitely a first pickable card, but I don't feel like it will be a straight up bomb in most decks, just because the legendary part will be difficult to make work on a regular basis, but I am giving it a B. Next up, we have Deafening Silence, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon enchantment, and it says each player can't cast more than 1 non-creature spell each turn. This is one of those cards that is horrible and limited because it was printed to be a sideboard card in constructed formats. Most opponents just won't have enough non-creature spells for this to do anything relevant. Even if you got to put this into play for free at the beginning of every game, most of the time it's still not going to do anything. And if that is sort of a litmus test you're doing for how good a card is, obviously that makes Deafening Silence horrible. Playing it for free on turn 1 every game probably still doesn't do anything. It's an F. Next up, we have Fairy Guidemother, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 common fairy. She has an adventure called Gift of the Fae, and you can pay 1 generic and a white to cast a sorcery adventure. And target creature gets +2/+1 and gains flying until end of turn. And she's a 1 mana 1/1 with flying. If either half of this was a card on its own, I don't think you would play either very often. Both are probably Ds. Sorcery speed pump effects like the adventure half are often pretty bad, and 1 mana 1/1 flyers are usually not the best unless a format has some special synergy for them. However, if I look at this as a 4 mana 1/1 flyer that gives +2/+1 and flying to one of your creatures until end of turn, I think that's an okay card. And like all the adventure cards, it's a little bit better than that because in a pinch, you can just cast it as a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. I'm not saying this is a great card or anything, but I think it does fall into the range of not feeling bad about playing it, which I think keeps it out of the D range. I think it's more like a C-. Next up, we have Flutter Fox, who for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 fox at common, and it says as long as you control an artifact or enchantment, Flutter Fox has flying. This is a nice 2-drop. 2 mana 2/2s are nothing special these days, but the fact that this can gain flying, and do it relatively easily in this format, makes it a 2-drop that is relevant all game long. I think most white decks will have 4 to 5 artifacts or enchantments or ways of making food, that this is going to be one of the better 2-drops you can get. Obviously, it gets even better if you have more artifacts and enchantments, and it basically always has flying, and I think that's entirely possible. I'm going to give this a C+. I think it's going to be a key card for lots of white decks in this format. Next up, we have Fortifying Provisions, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment. It says creatures you control get +0/+1, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a food token. I don't like this a lot. Adding toughness to your creatures is a lot worse than adding power in most cases. And also, getting food out of the deal doesn't make this seem any better to me. It is nice that it is a card that gives you both an artifact and an enchantment, and there are cards that care about that, so maybe in a blue-white deck that cares about that, it'll be a little bit better. I don't know. If you're in a super defensive deck too, maybe it's okay, but I'm basically not going to play this starting this format. I think it's mostly not going to be very good. I'm going to give it a D. Next up, we have Giant Killer, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 human peasant at rare. It's got adventure, and it has Chop Down as its adventure spell, which for 2 generic and a white is an instant, and it says destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. And when it's a creature, it's a 1 white mana 1/2 that you can pay 1 generic and a white and tap to tap target creature. The Adventure Sight here is kind of the white removal spell we see in most sets, capable of killing big creatures only, and the Creature Sight is basically Master Decoy. Stapling those two things together is great. I do think a lot of the time you'll play this on turn 1 if you have it, but the idea of killing a big guy and then bringing your giant killer to the board where it can proceed to shut down your opponent's best creature that is still on the board is awesome, and that will happen enough with this. It also is nice to be able to play an effect like Chop Down in your main board, which you just can't always do, but because this has a good card on the other side of it, you can do that. I mean, Master Decoy on its own is usually a B- or so, and I think adding the additional flexibility to be a removal spell gets this up to at least a B+. I think you first pick this almost every time you see it. Next up, we have Glass Casket, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon artifact. And when it enters the battlefield, it says exile target creature an opponent controls with converted mana cost 3 or less until Glass Casket leaves the battlefield. As an aside, before we start talking about the limited playability of this card, I'm not sure I like that so many artifacts aren't colorless these days, mostly because it's blurring the difference between enchantment and artifact, and I think this card does a good job of illustrating that since it's basically Silk Wrap, an enchantment we've seen before. But none of that really has to do with how good this card is, so let's talk about that. This is a nice card, just like Silk Wrap was. Sure, it only kills smaller guys, but that's fine because it does it so efficiently. This is in the lower range of premium removal. I'm giving it a B-. You'll first pick it in weaker packs. It's going to be even better in decks that really care about having artifacts in play too. Next up, we have Happily Ever After, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare enchantment with a massive text box that says, whenever it enters the battlefield, each player gains 5 life and draws a card. It also says, at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 5 colors among permanents you control, there are 6 or more card types among permanents you control and or cards in your graveyard, and your life total is greater than or equal to your starting life total, you win the game. This is not going to be good in Limited at all. Pulling off this win condition with this many requirements is going to be basically impossible in Limited, and being 3 mana for both players to gain 5 and draw a card doesn't really seem worth it to me. I'm giving this an F. Next, I have Harmonious Archon, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 4/5 Archon at Mythic Rare. It's got flying. It says non-Archon creatures have base power and toughness 3/3. And when it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens. This is a really interesting card. The most positive way to look at it is to say it costs 6 mana and gives you 10 power, 4 of which has flying, and that is certainly true. Sometimes it will play even better than that if you have a bunch of creatures in play. Other times it will play worse if your opponent has a bunch of creatures in play. I think you will be ahead enough of the time when you play this, since it is one card that gives you 3 pretty sizable bodies, that it will be pretty good most of the time. I do think that it is held back from straight up bomb status as a result of not always being able to turn the game around for you. Like if you're far enough behind, this isn't going to do anything. In fact, it'll help your opponent more than it helps you. But I think it's still good enough and has enough upside that it's almost in that bomb range. I'm going to give it a B+. Next up, we have Hushbringer, who for 1 generic and a white is a 1/2 ferry at rare. It's got flying and lifelink, and creatures entering the battlefield or dying don't cause abilities to trigger. I'm not sure that's grammatically correct, but that is what it says. So a 2 mana 1/2 with flying and lifelink is probably a C- or a C on its own. It isn't anything special, but you would play it in a lot of decks. Then you add the rest of the text, and what do you get? Well, you actually have a very powerful effect. The problem is that it's symmetrical, and this isn't constructed where you can sort of build a hate bear deck around this where all your creatures don't need to be having enter the battlefield or triggered abilities or abilities when they die. In Limited, it's going to be a lot harder to mold your deck around that. But if you can have it in play to nerf a few of your opponent's cards, that's going to feel pretty good. I think the symmetry of it makes it kind of a wash, though, and I think I just want to give this card a C. Sometimes you will actively not want to play it because of cards in your deck, so it is hard to go much higher than that. Next up, we have Knight of the Keep, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human knight at common, and that's it. This is classic D material. A vanilla 3 mana 3/2 just isn't really what you want to be doing. There are just so many better things you could be doing with that mana. You'll only play it begrudgingly if you need a 3-drop or more knights in your deck, or you're way short on creatures in your deck. You're never going to be happy to run this, but you'll do it if you have to. I do think the Knight creature type is enough to bump it from a D to a D+, though, so you'll play it sometimes in your Knight decks. Next up, we have Linden, the Steadfast Queen. She costs 3 white mana. She's a rare, legendary human noble. She's a 3/3. She has vigilance, and whenever a white creature you control attacks, you gain 1 life. So this set has a cycle of rares that ask you to be able to pay 3 of the same mana, and they all pay you off for having lots of cards with the same color. Most of them I think are worth first picking despite really asking you to be monocolored or mostly one color, but this first one we're looking at this week is probably the worst of the bunch. If I'm having to construct a mana base to support something like this, I want more of a payoff than a 3 mana 3/3 with Vigilance that can gain me some life. The other cards in this cycle have far better static abilities. Now, obviously, if you're mono white, she is a great card, but really, she may still not be the best card in your deck. So I think I'm going to give her a C+ to reflect the fact that I just won't want to be taking her early because she isn't worth the risk. Pick her up after you're already pretty deep in white, but don't do it before. Next, we have Lonesome Unicorn, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/3 unicorn with Vigilance. It also has an adventure spell. In this case, it can be cast as a sorcery to make a 2/2 white knight creature token with Vigilance. So, again, neither half of this card is particularly efficient. A sorcery that was 3 mana for a 2/2 token with Vigilance would probably be a D, and a 5 mana 3/3 with Vigilance is probably also a D or D-. But this card can do both of those things, and that's the beauty of a lot of these adventures. Because in this case, both of those things create a creature, this can allow a 2-for-1 pretty regularly. I think ideally you want to be doing both halves of this so you get both cards out of it, and sometimes though you will just have to cast it as a 3/3 unicorn, which won't feel too good, but I still think this is an okay playable. It's also nice that it supports the green-white adventure archetype, and it happens to involve a knight, so it will fit knight decks as well. I think this is a C-, a solid playable, but one you're going to cut a significant chunk of the time. Next up, we have Mysterious Pathlighter, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 ferry at uncommon. It's got flying, and it says, each creature you control that has an adventure enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. It also has crucial reminder text. It says it doesn't need to have gone on the adventure first. So this is a Windrake with serious upside. 3 mana 2/2 flyer is still a pretty acceptable rate, and on its own that would probably be a C- or a C, but the adventure payoff here is incredibly strong, and even if you get only 1 +1/+1 counter out of this, and I think you'll be able to do that on average, you are really coming out ahead mana-wise. Making all creatures with adventures permanently larger is powerful, and that makes the Pathlighter the kind of uncommon that can completely alter the game. As we've already seen, cards with adventure aren't a rarity in white, and I would imagine you get 4 more ways to go on adventures in the format without too much trouble, and that's definitely enough for this card to be powerful. Obviously, it gets better the more adventuring you do, and yeah, remember, you don't have to have the creature go on an adventure first, you can just hard cast it for its regular creature cost, and we'll get that counter. Either way, I think you first pick this in a lot of packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Outflank, which for 1 white mana is a common instant, and it says Outflank deals damage to target attacking or blocking creature equal to the number of creatures you control. This is a very conditional removal spell. It reminds me a little bit of Outnumber, which we've seen in the past, but the big difference between Outnumber and Outflank, both of which do damage equal to the number of creatures you have in play, is Outnumber could hit anything, not only things that are attacking or blocking. Asking for all of that is a pretty big thing to ask for. This can also be interfered with relatively easily, namely, if one of your creatures is killed, so the damage that does lethal originally to one of your opponent's creatures no longer does lethal because they killed one of your creatures, is not going to be great. Sure, it only costs a single white mana, and it will probably feel nice when you're the beatdown, but with all the conditions it requires, it isn't the kind of removal spell you take very early at all. Mostly, I think this is just a solid card and not much more than that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Prized Griffin, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/4 Griffin at common, and it has flying. 5 mana 3/4 flyers have played pretty well lately. I don't think it's an amazing rate or anything, but we've seen several of these lately, and they have always been reasonable 5-drops. You aren't excited about this card, but I don't think you hate running the first copy either. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Rally for the Throne, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says create 2 1/1 white human creature tokens, and it has Adamant. If you at least pay 3 white mana to cast this spell, you gain 1 life for each creature you control. So if you can't get to Adamant with this, you're paying 1 extra mana for Raise the Alarm, but honestly, as a fail case, that isn't too bad. Raise the Alarm is usually one of white's best commons when we see it, and I think if we ignored Adamant on this card, you'd still play this sometimes if you're really interested in white. Being an instant is always nice in stuff like this too, because it can let you surprise your opponent by suddenly being able to block or trade with stuff. So what if you always gained life equal to the creatures in play? Well, that would probably be a C+. As it stands, I think we have to move it down to a C to reflect the fact that a lot of the time you just won't be able to make it adamant. But, if you're a mono white deck, you'll be able to make it adamant a lot more often. Next up, we have Realm Cloaked Giant, which for 5 generic and 2 white is a 7/7 Mythic Rare Giant with Vigilance. He's also got an adventure called Cast Off, and for 3 generic and 2 white, it's a sorcery and it can destroy all non-giant creatures. This is really good, and a really nice design on one of these adventure cards. Having one card that wraths, and then as a 7 mana 7/7 a few turns later is pretty amazing. It's sort of like guaranteeing when you cast a wrath that you'll be hitting a creature that will definitely be the largest one on the board. It isn't that far from being a 5 mana wrath that puts a 7/7 into play in 2 turns, and that's pretty awesome. That's maybe a little hyperbolic, but you get my point. A 7 mana 7/7 with Vigilance is certainly not an incredible card on its own, but after a wrath, it's going to dominate the board. Wraths aren't good in every deck usually, but I think this one can be good in any deck, especially because if you end up in a situation where you don't really want a Wrath, you still have your Realm Cloaked Giant. It doesn't stay in your hand while you wait for an opportunity that makes sense, it just gives you a creature. I think this is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. I think you first pick it every time you see it. Next up we have Righteousness, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon instant, and it says, target blocking creature gets +7/+7 until end of turn. I think a lot of people will see the 1 mana for +7/+7 here and overrate this. It's a card we've seen before, and while that's a huge stats boost, the fact that it only works on blocked creatures is a huge limitation. Combat tricks are usually used the most by aggressive players. This one wants you to be defensive, and hey, I'm not saying it's terrible, just only good if you have a very defensive deck, and it still comes with all the downsides of a combat trick. You can easily get 2 for 1 in response, for example, and a deck that's blocking a lot doesn't want to be putting itself in that situation very often. I think that I'm going to avoid playing this most of the time, just because you can't guarantee it will always be useful. There are plenty of games where being defensive never really makes sense. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, we have Shepherd of the Flock, who for 1 generic into white is a 3/1 human peasant at uncommon. He's got an adventure called Usher to Safety. It's an instant, and you can pay 1 white to cast this instant that says return target permanent you control to its owner's hand. I like the design here. A 2 mana 3/1 is probably a C- in most formats on its own, but this comes with some nice additional value thanks to the adventure half. This isn't a card where the adventure half will always become useful at some point in the game, and most of the time this will probably just be a 2 mana 3/1. But there is some real upside in returning your own stuff to your hand. There's the usual stuff, getting rid of your opponent's aura-based removal, doing it in response to a removal spell, and abusing Enter the Battlefield abilities. But in this set, you can also use it to get another use out of an adventure, and all of that together seems like solid upside to me. If the adventure doesn't do anything for you, you still have a reasonably efficient creature. I think that makes this a solid C, and a 2-drop that you'll probably play a couple of in white decks and feel fine about. Next up, we have Shining Armor, which for 1 generic into white is a common artifact equipment. It's got flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you attach it to a knight you control. Equipped creature gets +0/+2 and has vigilance, and it has an equip cost of 3. I don't like this very much. Sure, it's an equipment with flash that attaches itself to knights for free when it comes down, but the bonus it gives isn't anything special. Would I be that excited about a 2 mana enchantment that gave one of my creatures +0/+2 at instant speed? Not really. And yes, this is a little better than that in some ways in that it survives even if your creature dies, but it's not that much better. Once you have to start paying 3 mana to put this on stuff, it's really going to hurt. I think even in a knight deck, this isn't the payoff you're hoping for. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, we have Silver Flame Ritual, which for 3 generic into white is a common sorcery. It says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. It's got adamant, and it says if at least 3 white mana was spent to cast this spell, creatures you control gain vigilance until end of turn. On its own, this would be an okay card, even if it didn't have Adamant. You need to have some setup, namely you need to be going wide, but that seems doable. Vigilance is some real upside, though, that you get with Adamant because it means that you can attack with everyone and still leave blockers behind. Turns like that can really turn the tide in games. But it is a little clunky at 4 mana, and it won't always be giving your guys Vigilance, and you're not always going to be in situations where it's really worth doing, because if you have like 2 creatures in play, it's not going to feel so good. I think all of those limitations really hold it down to a C-. I could definitely see it moving up if Adamant is easier to make work than I'm thinking it is. Next up, we have Silver Flame Squire, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 human soldier at common. And it's got an adventure. Its adventure is an instant. It's on alert, which for 2 generic and a white is a combat trick that says target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn, untap it. So 2 mana for a 2/1's a D, and a 3 mana combat trick that pumps your guy and untaps it probably is too. But as I've been saying with a lot of these adventure cards, the fact that it can do both makes it considerably better. This is another one that can allow you to get a 2-for-1 without a ton of effort. Use the trick to either kill something in combat or save a creature from removal, and then play a 2 mana 2/1 who can trade with some stuff, and you'll feel pretty good about your chances. Now, I do think this is one where sometimes you'll just have to play it on turn 2 as a 2/1 because you need to be developing your board. But the nice thing is you can cast it that way when it's best for you and just not do it when it isn't necessary, and try to get the full value of a 2-for-1 out of the card. This is a solid little 2-drop for white decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Ceralun, the Lion's Claw, who for 3 generic and 2 white is an uncommon legendary human knight. He's a 4/4. He's got first strike, and whenever he attacks, other creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. All of the Sirs in this cycle are pretty good, and Allen is no exception there. A 5 mana 4/4 with first strike is already a nice stat line, probably a C+. Then when you add the ability to pump your whole board, except for himself, when he attacks, and you have a very powerful uncommon here. Also, thanks to first strike, taking him down in combat won't be easy, and he may get the chance to swing a few more times, which is obviously especially potent because of all the power he adds to your board. I think he's a pretty easy first pick. I'm giving him a B. Next, we have Trapped in the Tower, which for 1 generic and a white is a common aura. It's an enchantment. It says enchant creature without flying, enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. It's a little annoying that this can't hit flyers, but the fact that it both pacifies and arrests a ground creature helps me get over that. The problem pacifism has sometimes is it doesn't stop creatures with powerful activated abilities. With Trapped in the Tower, you get to stop those as well as blocking and attacking. 2 mana is pretty great for this effect. It's premium removal, and I think it's a B. You usually first pick this, and it's also splashable, and that's certainly nice. Next up, we have True Love's Kiss, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a common instant. It says exile target artifact or enchantment, draw a card. I think this format has enough artifacts and enchantments that this is kind of main boardable. It's a pretty healthy sub-theme in this set. Artifacts and enchantments, that's something we've already seen. It's probably still better out of your sideboard, but I think it's probably like a C- in your main deck and probably a B- against opponents who have a lot of artifacts and enchantments. Getting a 2-for-1 out of this is pretty sweet when you know your opponent has lots of targets for it. Next up, we have Venerable Knight, which for 1 white mana is a 2/1 human knighted uncommon. And when it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target knight you control. A 1 mana 2/1 with some upside is nice, mostly because it can trade up with lots of creatures, even those with mana costs of 3 or 4, and it attacks really well early. The nice upside of also putting a counter on one of your other knights when it dies is also pretty sweet. This will be a nice card for most white decks, but I don't think you need to take it really early. I'm giving it a C. It's still going to lose relevance on boards too often to really be worth valuing more than that. Next up, we have Worthy Knight, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human knighted rare, and it says whenever you cast a knight spell, create a 1/1 white human creature token. So this is sort of a build around in that it gets better the more knights you have, but if you're playing white, as we've seen, you're going to end up with enough knights for this to be quite good. And if you end up in any of the Mardu colors, it will be even easier to get knights. A 2 mana 2/2 with serious upside is awesome, as this can really change games just by getting a couple of tokens out. I think you can first pick this pretty confidently, and you should value knights a little more, but again, you're probably going to be doing that anyway in white. I'm giving this a B. Our last white card is Youthful Knight, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/1 human knight at common, and it's got first strike. This guy's a reprint and a pretty nice one. 2-mana 2/1 first strikers tend to play really well in aggressive decks, but they aren't really bad in less aggressive ones, as they are great blockers against smaller creatures too. There is a lot of equipment in this set, and obviously it plays well with a creature with first strike. As we've seen in this video, white has several nice 2-drops, and this is yet another one. Definitely matters that it also has a useful creature type. I think this is a C+. I don't imagine ever not just running all of these that you get your hands on, but I wouldn't take it crazy early or anything. So that's all the white cards in Throne of Eldraine and how good I think they'll be in this new limited format. Check back tomorrow to see me talk about all the blue cards in Throne of Eldraine. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it as well. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if it's later in the week and the set review is underway, you should see the playlist for that set review on your screen now. Thanks for watching.